Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Mercedes got their first win of the season at the Montreal Grand Prix, helped in part by upgrades they brought to the weekend, but this is not the only upgrade they are going to be bringing from now to the end of the season. Confirmation from the team there will be more upgrades on their car, arriving for the Austrian Grand Prix literally next time out. Is this the start of something for George Russell, for Kimi Antonelli and Mercedes, and now to the end of the season? Could they be a serious threat? And many of the races still to come, especially with changes on the way that Ferrari on the other side of things do not seem to be doing. Do the Scuderia need to take notes about the way that Mercedes have approached this season with respect to expectations compared to where Ferrari currently stands? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, I wanted to touch on Alpine and Luca Di Maio. So there was so much happening this weekend. We didn't really get to talk about this. That Luca Di Maio, so this fella, is gone. Now, well, it's been an incredibly dramatic time as always of Renault. There's really no surprises there. Of course, with Flavio Briatore coming back into play and everything from the team perspective, but he is the top dog at the Renault group, like above Alpine, calling the shots from the top end. And we know that there's been, lots of people getting fired and changes being made, and Luca Di Maio seemed to be a big part of that. And it seems like now, maybe the fact that the Formula 1 team is struggling, I don't know, like what the reasons could be, but he's been sacked effectively. He's out of that position, so Luca Di Maio is gone. And it is interesting because I think in many respects, people would argue, looking at Di Maio and what he's done with Renault Group over the last few years, has actually been very good for the company in general. But some decisions that have been made maybe haven't been for the best. And yeah, there's an argument that he turned the Renault Group around over the last couple of years and reinvented what Alpinism was meant to be. But arguably, he was the wrong guy for the job at this moment. Some of the decisions that were made with regard to the Formula 1 project in recent times may be rather controversial, and there's a feeling that, his abrupt departure is a sign of headwinds coming for the car industry and, of course, the Formula 1 team. Doubtful to be helped, of course, by the current predicament in the championship. Yeah, we know that Alpine are really looking to 2026. They're going to have the Mercedes engines on board and all of those implications. But as Gasly says, look, can we get some unity, please, lads? Once again, the French team is going through it. And in the current team standings, Alpine are rock bottom. Now, they've actually got 11 points, which is not great. I mean, they're averaging, a point per race, pretty much, point per race weekends. It's not great, but it's not horrific. It's just the other teams have done much better. Haas have scored a lot of points, although that's fallen off recently. Same for Racing Bulls, you could argue as well. They're always generally in the mix to be on the verge. Williams started promisingly, but then have fallen away in recent rounds, which is, to be fair, to be expected. Even Williams said this, that they're expecting Aston Martin and other teams to bring some upgrades, and Williams aren't going to do anything to their car. So the reality is Williams will still be okay on weekends where their car seems to suit the track. This weekend actually was one of them. There was a lot of optimism around Williams, certainly after what happened in FP1, FP2. Then that rather, certainly FP1, then it rather fell apart through the rest of the weekends. Sainz still picked up a couple of points with good strategy. Not the same story for Albon, who of course retired. Another Mercedes-engined car that retired from a Grand Prix, it must be said. A few races in a row now where that's happened. Why? I guess time will tell. We'll probably get the answer soon enough. There's different explanations for why Russell's car and why Antonelli's car failed over the last few rounds. Alonso, of course, as well had the failure in Monaco. So something to say on that, but Aston are making progress now, right? Alonso scored points now for the last couple of rounds. He's qualified very well for the last few rounds as well. And now Sauber and Nico Hülkenberg, they continue to cook up as well, and they've got 20 points on the board. So Alpine are dead last in the current constructors standings. That's probably not exactly helped Luca Di Maio's position, given all the talk about, we're going to win races within 5 years or 3 years or podiums or, whatever Alpine say. The reality, of course, is rather different. The Drivers' Championship looks like this. The only changes, Ocon overtook Hadjar, so he's up into P9, Hadjar down to 10th, then Albon, Antonelli, Hamilton, Leclerc, Russell, Verstappen, Norris, and then Piastri. So a 22-point gap at the top of the championship after Norris DNF'd of his own doing in Canada. Verstappen is then a further 21 points back, so it's 43 for Max to the top of the grid, and Russell at 136. He's not far away from Max. He's not a million miles away from the two McLarens. Look, if the Mercedes is all of a sudden the best car, which it's not, and it's not going to be, but if it was, then Russell is not totally out of the conversation, right? Like, he's 62 points behind. that would be a good couple of, like the Mercedes would have to be the dominant force for Russell to overturn that kind of a deficit. But I think what's more, because Russell ain't going to win the title, but the point is that Russell's done, I would say, a pretty commendable job to be in the conversation, rather. We've talked about how good Max has been, which he has been excellent, but equally Russell has, been maybe just as good in terms of maximising the package that he's had weekends to weekends, and certainly we've seen that in recent days, and we'll get to Mercedes more in a second. Before we get there, let's talk Kyalami, because there's lots of talk about returning to Africa, having a Grand Prix on all of the continents. The most recent one in 1993, won by Alain Prost. Now, Kyalami could potentially return to the calendar, because the FIA have given it a 3-year window to execute on changes that have been proposed to make it a Grade 1 standard circuit where F1 could potentially return. So Kyalami has obtained the FIA Grade 1 status required to host it if they, do the planned reforms. So the FIA have looked at the plans, looked at the situation and said, okay, if we do X, Y, Z, then you guys can, be a Grade 1 listed circuit and once again potentially be on the Formula 1 calendar. Now look, is this a circuit as good? As much as it would be cool to go to South Africa and race on that continent, people will say, well, look, this circuit isn't as good as Hockenheim, it's not as good as Istanbul Park, it's not as good as Sepang, stuff like this. But as we know in Formula 1, the quality of the track isn't necessarily the big deciding factor as to whether certain countries get a Grand Prix or not. And it's going to be a few years away if this happens anyway, but just something to keep in mind that the FIA have said, look, you guys can do it if we do this, and then F1 could be in an interesting position. And maybe in a couple of years, yeah, the circuit gets pretty narrow in places. Maybe in a couple of years when this circuit would potentially be approved, the cars are smaller, they're lighter, they're more nimble, they're more agile. They might be better to race as they were around here back in the day. Just quickly on Ferrari, although we will discuss them in a second with respect to Mercedes and the challenges that, Ferrari are currently going through. Leclerc and Zhou are going to do some tyre testing. So tomorrow and the day after, they're going to do some 2026 Pirelli wet tyre testing. Zhou is going to drive on the 19th. Leclerc is going to be on the car on the 20th. Zhou's still keeping his name in the conversation just because we know that Cadillac are interested in drivers for next year. They, of course, are looking at Sergio Perez, as we know. There are other interested parties as well. Zhou is potentially one of them. Big exposure to the Chinese market. That could be important for General Motors and Cadillac. Something to keep an eye on going forwards, given that conversation. Ferrari do have upgrades on the way, but we've been talking about this for months, and they've not really brought any yet. Hamilton's like, I don't know why. Again, there were rumours that they could bring some things for Austria, but they're not going to. They're trying to prepare their new rear suspension in time for Silverstone. And Ferrari have new updates on the way, new rear suspension, new floor, but why haven't they been produced yet? Why they keep getting delayed? It's a big question. And yeah, there's maybe some optimism that if this works for Ferrari, they can become the second fastest team, they can score some more consistent podiums, maybe they can win a Grand Prix in the same way that Russell did this past weekend. But for now, compared to expectations of the season, Ferrari are nowhere near, whereas Mercedes, on the other hand, I think are doing particularly well, certainly in George Russell's hands, and Antonelli as well, given the fact that he's a rookie, has done a stellar job. He, of course, scored a podium for the first time this past weekend. His pace in qualifying compared to Russell hasn't been, maybe as close as I was expecting, or maybe I was hoping him to be really competitive to make it more interesting at Mercedes, that internal battle. And maybe you could argue that Russell's performance is getting slightly flattered by teaming with a rookie, but equally Antonelli is no ordinary rookie. The preparation that he's had, I think the things that he's going to go on to achieve, I'm very optimistic that Antonelli's going to do great things, and equally that Russell is doing very, very well, putting in the performances that he is with respect to Antonelli as well. I don't think it's a massive flattery on Russell that it's not like he's teaming with Latifi, let's just put it that way, from back in the day in Williams. I think it's a different Russell you're seeing in the car nowadays. And maybe it's the same Russell that it always was, but it's a more assured, confident, mature George Russell who is becoming very difficult indeed to beat when he has the machinery to do so. And as you know, in my opinion, he definitely has the right attitude, George, to be, the champion that he wants to be in Formula 1. Not going to happen this year regarding anything dramatic happening from now to the end of the season, but we shall see. Before we get to Mercedes, big update on Aston Martin. So Adrian Newey is spending his time sitting in front of the whiteboard, drawing lines and creating the 2026 car for Aston Martin, Fernando Alonso, and who knows who other drivers they may have over the coming years as well. Newey, however, said, yes, Lawrence, this factory is amazing. We've got the best facilities in the world. We've got the best wind tunnel, got the best resources. There's no reason why this factory isn't the factory of a winning team in Formula One at some point in the relatively near future. But Newey did say they have a major issue. Yeah, the wind tunnel is great, but the simulations, as in the software that tells you what the car will do on the track in real life, is not working as planned. And Newey said that's a major issue they have, and he said this publicly as well. This is not something that he's only said behind the scenes. He revealed publicly that their simulations right now are not working, and therefore it's tough to use the wind tunnel for its maximum effectiveness, even for 2026, even though it's ready to go and they're preparing to use it and all these other things, because they can't really trust fully that what numbers they're plugging in are actually the numbers they get out. And this is not an easy problem to solve. I think Newey even said it's going to be a 2-year problem to solve. So, I don't think Aston Martin, given that circumstance, should necessarily expect to arrive in 2026 and win immediately. That is potentially a plan. But, as this article describes, and the race reveals in their article, Giles Wood, who I looked him up, and we'll see it in a second what he looks like and all this, because there's not many pictures of the guy floating around. But Giles Wood used to work with Newey back at Red Bull back in the day when they were working with Sebastian Vettel. He worked closely with Newey as he headed up Red Bull's simulation and analysis department during its golden era of success with Sebastian Vettel. He has now been convinced to return and has joined Aston Martin as its simulation and vehicle modelling director, and will play a critical role in delivering improvements to an area of performance that Newey has singled out as lacking right now. During an appearance in Monaco, Newey said that Aston's simulator correlation was behind where it needed to be. It's fair to say some of our tools are weak, particularly the driver in the loop simulator. It needs a lot of work because it's not correlating at all at the moment. It's a fundamental research tool. It's probably a 2-year project. Yeah, pretty much all of the things that I just mentioned. Now, Giles Wood is this guy. So here we are on his LinkedIn page. Now, went to Cambridge, works currently at Apple. Now, on his LinkedIn, it still says that he works at Apple in San Francisco Bay Area. That, it seems, is set to change in the near future. If we look at his, let's say, experience, he was simulation lead at McLaren 04 to 06, head of simulation at Red Bull 07 to 10, and then chief engineer in simulation and analysis until 2014. Then he became their technical director for 3 years after that. Since then, he's worked at Apple, right, as an engineering manager. So pretty remarkable in the autonomous technologies sector. So kind of a remarkable career. And it seems to me that Lawrence Stroll has heard Newey's comments, and Newey has said, look, this is lacking in this area. And Stroll says, okay, how do we fix it? Who should we get? What's the plan? And Newey says, look, if you go get Giles, he was the man for the job at Red Bull back in the day, he'll fix it up. Lawrence Stroll goes out there, gets out the wallet, I'm imagining, gets out the checkbook, and he goes to Giles and says, right, how much is it going to take to convince you to come back from Formula One from Apple? And apparently that's what he's going to do. The racer talking about it. We've got other publications talking about it as well. So that's pretty fascinating as far as I'm concerned. And I think it shows the lengths to which Aston Martin are willing to go to make this project happen. But, like nothing in Formula One, nothing happens overnight. And it will be a project for them if they want to get to where they want to be. Let's talk, though, about Mercedes, because a great weekend for Mercedes and George Russell. Wins the Grand Prix, first Grand Prix win of the season for Mercedes. Of course, they had a handful last year. They had that really strong stint around Silverstone, around Spa. Of course, Austria, George managed to win as well in controversial fashion after the guys up front crashed. But this year they were expected, to kick on to some degree. They were expected to improve their car. Last year's car had various issues at the start of the season, which they resolved to some extent. But they've never, Mercedes, fully gotten to grips with this ground effect era. And there was always a feeling that this year Mercedes were going to be a step behind because simply Ferrari and McLaren and even Red Bull were expected to take a big step forward, while Mercedes is still figuring out their platform. And now they seem to have got there. It's not like their car is perfect, but they've definitely got a more benign machine and a compliance machine than they've had in the ground effect era so far. And it's a good enough machine on its day to win races. Now, how much of that was to do with the conditions of the track? The fact that it's one that suits Mercedes, that they're happy with. With respect to the other tracks on the calendar, I think Mercedes always expected they would go well this weekend, and there's some talk about that in a second. I'll just quickly mention on Antonelli. Today was a big day for Antonelli because I think it was his final exams basically in Italy. And it's pretty remarkable how he came out of his exams and was immediately thrust in front of the media to talk about how it all went. So, yeah, hopefully it all went to plan for Antonelli after just getting off the podium, and he's straight into the interview pen. And apparently this is a pretty common thing, right, because these exams are very important, so it's not unusual to see kids get interviewed about how things went. But, yeah, the fact that it was Antonelli on this occasion, I thought was pretty entertaining for him. But Mercedes aren't that surprised, right? Like, they were expecting Canada to be strong. It was strong for them last year. It has been a very strong track for that team historically. But the fact that they were able to not deal with the overheating problems they have had recently was a major point of improvement for the team. There was talk from Helmut Marko before the race that it looked like in the, let's say, the race runs on the Friday, that Mercedes was struggling with their tyres more than the Red Bull were, but it was actually completely the other way around, and the Red Bull was suffering on its tyres more than the Mercedes was. Toto says no illusions about this performance. It may not be totally to do with the new rear suspension that they brought in. There may be, other factors as well in play, and it was always going to be a strong circuit for them. But the fact that it was so strong, and Antonelli was able to, relatively comfortably in the end hold on to third place. If strategy had gone differently, maybe they could have even had a 1-2, and probably Russell was doing a lot of management in terms of pace towards the end of the Grand Prix as well. That's not it, though, for Mercedes. They brought an upgrade in Canada. I think they brought a couple of things. One of the main things was their suspension that they brought back in. They'd actually introduced that suspension back in Imola. Hadn't really gone to plan and given them the results they wanted. But then they realised that actually the suspension they brought in was fine, it's just their setup wasn't great, that they ran with it. So they were pretty confident they could bring it back, they could make the setup adjustments they wanted, they brought a couple of other pieces as well, and all of a sudden, the car's on top form again, in conditions that were hot and tricky and, arguably were not expected to give some serious outcomes. But that's exactly what happened for Mercedes. And now there's talk that actually there's more upgrades on the way. Going into Austria, we have also new parts coming into the car in those races that they will always help, let's say, in improving the performance. So let's see what we can get in Austria. As I say, George won in Austria last year after Max and Lando collided in the final few laps of the Grand Prix. The team is feeling confident that Mercedes could be back in business. Now, is this going to be like another false dawn for the team? Seen it so many times over the last few years. Mercedes think they've made a stride, they've made a step forward, they've made some progress, and then in the next few rounds it goes back to normality. Look, do I expect Mercedes to start winning races week in, week out? No. Do I think they will win again, probably, from now to the end of the season? I think on this evidence, the answer is probably yes to that. Russell's performing very well. We know how good he is on a Saturday. We know how important qualifying is this season, given the cars are pretty similar in performance, and it's difficult to get the required delta right now to actually make an overtake on the guy ahead unless there's a major tyre offset. This year, outside of the two McLarens, Max has 5 podiums, George has 5 podiums, right? Like, that's the level of performance I think that we have seen between those two guys. Antonelli got his first one just this past weekend. And I think Ferrari will be looking at this thinking, look, yeah, Mercedes have struggled in this ground effect era, getting things underway. They were knocked off their perch dramatically in 2022, and they've been trying to fight back all the way since then. But finally, it feels like they're starting to make some progress. This season, McLaren made such a big stride over the winter that anyone beating them, apart from Max Verstappen and a Red Bull that obviously suits him quite nicely, although it's far from perfect, is the only real serious contender. The fact that Mercedes are in the conversation to be, scoring race wins and scoring double podiums is impressive, because Ferrari were meant to be there. Ferrari were meant to be right in that conversation, if not further up, but actually they're nowhere near, and maybe there's some level of continuity and consistency and, let's say, stability in that Mercedes outfit, which has created some of these good results compared to where Ferrari currently resides. But enjoy your thoughts in the comments. The kind of remarkable thing is, now this was tweeted out on the 17th of June actually, so yeah, this does now, I believe, include the new Mercedes double podium, because of course they had the double podium in Las Vegas last year. McLaren have had 10 in the last 12 months, Ferrari have had 3, Mercedes with 2, and Alpine, remarkably enough, with 1. But, no Red Bull, of course, on the list. So that's the issue, and that's pretty remarkable. We looked at it at the start of the video, right? Max Verstappen is at 155 points, Red Bull are at 162, right? So his teammates have scored a grand total of 7 points. It's arguably another reason why Red Bull were so keen to make sure Max didn't get a penalty, and like another penalty point, and the drama with Russell at the Canadian Grand Prix towards the end, because if Max wasn't driving in Austria, that's Red Bull's home Grand Prix. Like, that would be nothing short of an absolute embarrassment, I imagine. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.